So what are RxJava and what are reactive APIs? So it's about reactive data handling. The way it works is that you have observables, which is a way to consume some kind of not really external data, and when observable receives the data, you start reacting to it. So then it gets passed to the operators. Usually they're used for processing, changing data, and at the very end there are subscribers that receive the data, and then it's maybe shown in the user interface. So here we can see one of the simplest flows that you can create in RxJava. So it's going to emit 3 letters, and then using map operator, they're going to be uppercased. It references a method here, uppercase letter. Then using the letter, we're going to retrieve the data, maybe some other data from external source, and finally, maybe going to show a notification to the user. So there's a lot more to RxJava, so I encourage you to do research on your own. It's a really powerful and important framework. So for example, there's a book called Reactive Android Programming. It's really relevant, so I encourage you to read that. Integrating RxJava into project. So we'll just get to the meat right away, and it's the dependencies. So you're gonna need a few dependencies here. So the main one is RxJava. Contains the core libraries here. And then there's RxAndroid. It has some utility methods that are used on Android, and it's going to be very useful here. And finally, there's Rx Lifecycle library from Trello, which we're going to use for activity lifecycle management, and it's going to be a lot easier to integrate RxJava with activities using this helper library. Now let's take a look at the build file. Again, it's very simple. You just copy the code, you recompile the project, and you're ready to go. Example use of RxJava API. In this example, we're going to take a look how to make our current views reactive. So here we have this view activity. So a few things happening here. Before we had this view interface, but now we changed it to the view activity. In the end, it's going to be a simpler way to have the same functionality, and it's going to be more generic, more robust. So as before, we have some generics, and they are used to parameterize data class. We're going to show that the data class we're going to be using, it will have to extend serializable class. And what's interesting here that we have this Rx app compat activity that we extend, which is Rx lifecycle activity. So it has some neat integration with RxJava, like lifecycle methods and so on. So that's it about view activity. Then there are a few changes in the view model. So what's different here that we use a subject, and the subject is an observable, to process and pass around data that this view model holds. So the way it's handled is that when we bind now our view model to the activity, and it has to be view activity, it binds to the lifecycle, comes from RxJava library, or Rx lifecycle. So when we bind this lifecycle method, we look for the event that's called activity start. And when the activity basically started, we then start processing, emitting data from this subject to the render method. So there's quite a bit of things going on here. You will need to read up on RxJava a bit more. But the big idea is that we wait until activity starts, then we switch our current subscription to data subject subscription, and we then keep passing data to the render method of the activity. And all of that happens on Android mainframe. When we want to update the data, we call this update method, and it passes to the observable subject, behavior subject, this new data using method on next. And that's the most of it. Now we can take a quick look, maybe the list view activity, and we'll see that render method hasn't changed. It still takes this portfolio list data, but the way it's just called is now being done by RxJava. So I encourage you to check out this version and do your own further research through all the changes. But that's the most important change that we did here when we started using Activity Lifecycle. Introducing Retrofit library. So basically, Retrofit is a library for HTTP requests. So you can make HTTP, HTTPS requests for various kinds of services. The setup here is simple. We have a basic Retrofit library. Then we have a JSON converter that's for converting data between JSON and our custom types. And then we have some adapters for RxJava, so it works with our RxJava framework. And finally, some logging dependencies. As an example, we could take a look at this GitHub service. We can see that Retrofit can provide a simple interface, and I mean by simple that it will return observable with our created custom types from some remote endpoint. So in this case, for example, listing repositories for some specific user. In our case, we use this Retrofit library to query stock price updates for our stock portfolio. Let's take a look at the code. Here we're going to use a service called IEX trading, and we're going to have our data service for this that's going to query a quote for a specific stock symbol. So the interface is very simple. It returns just a single, well, single is like observable. It's going to basically return an observable for this one specific symbol. And the type of the symbol, well, it's just, well, what we care about here is the symbol and latest price. It has some more data, but we're going to ignore that for now. The way we create the service is that we use this service factory, which basically builds multiple dependencies that are needed for Retrofit library. So like HTTP logging, that's very useful when you are developing. Then it's going to use OK HTTP client. It has some custom parameters here. And finally, we create our Retrofit library. Well, it's like interface to a Retrofit library using the OK HTTP client. Then we add our adapters, converters, and we specify base URL that we're going to be using for our queries. Finally, using this Retrofit interface, we expose our data service, and that's what we're going to use. So for example, the way it could be used is that when we initialize stock update service class, we get a quote and then we subscribe to the changes. So whenever we receive a new item, and in this case it's just going to be just a single item, we output it into the console. So again, it's just a very convenient library when you're working with the internet services, and usually they are done over HTTP, so it's basically a must in your toolbox. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at the dependency injection and how it helps to create a better code.